The real power in Britain, on a day-to-day level for sure, rests with what I call the quangocracy. So what's she for? What's the point of having an education secretary? If you're armed with a graph, you can basically get away with anything. These preposterous decisions, you can't send me back to Albania. My son likes the flavour of chicken nuggets. But why do we want judges to make those sorts of decisions? It isn't just a nuance, an HR training scheme. It is a major deal.
Mark, is Britain becoming or moving into a sort of post-democratic state of affairs?
At speed, sadly. Look, I don't want to completely overstate this. We do not live in the United Kingdom in the equivalent of North Korea, and not yet even in the equivalent of the former East Germany, the German Democratic Republic. But what we've witnessed over the past 20, 25 years, maybe a little longer than that, is de facto, even if not de jure, power has been basically transferred from democratic elected politicians to bureaucrats. Now, technically, if our parliament decides something, passes a bill, they all get together and decide something's got to change, they can do it. But it's often an exercise in pushing water uphill. The real power in Britain, on a day-to-day level for sure, rests with what I call the quangocracy, a network of so-called arm's-length bodies, independent of the government. That's often heralded as one of their great virtues. We're going to hear from the independent such and such watchdog, who are effectively managing the day-to-day affairs of the nation. And there are countless examples of it. My favourite one was a few months ago. An incident had happened in a school, I can't remember precisely where, and I don't know the full details of the incident, but the gist of it was a 9-year-old boy had accused another pupil of smelling like fish. The reaction to this was to call in the police. It wasn't dealt with by the teaching authorities. And suddenly what was, sounds like a rather minor classroom scrap is all over the front pages, and apparently a police matter. The Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson, is then asked onto various television stations to explain what the heck was going on, to which her response was, "I can't possibly comment on operational matters." So we essentially have a political elite, the MPs at least, cabinet ministers, who are the rough equivalent of a Potemkin village. Everybody goes around pretending that Bridget Phillipson is in charge of what goes on in a classroom, but she isn't. It's an operational matter, apparently. So what's she for? What's the point of having an education secretary? Why don't we just leave the schooling of our children to some, Ofsted bureaucracy and the police, apparently? Absolutely extraordinary. That's just one small example. We have endless others. Can you build a railway line or do you actually have to install a bat tunnel in order to preserve bats, in order to keep natural England off your back? Nearly impossible to build anything in this country, in part due to our planning laws, but also in part due to natural England. We've finally got rid of NHS England, the biggest quango in the world, but we're bringing in endless other quangos. The Labour government is beginning to indicate it might attack this arm's length way of running Britain. But I think at present count, they've brought in 28 new arm's length bodies to run us, and have only abolished 2 or are considering abolishing 4.
How many are there approximately?
So numbers vary because it's a bit like, trying to count the number of grains of sand on a beach. But the latest estimate I heard was 444.
That's
independent long list. I mean, it really should be 666, shouldn't it? But 444 bodies who, in a whole plethora of ways, regulate and determine our lives, and are only to some degree answerable to Parliament. It is true Parliament could choose to abolish them. The buck still stops with Parliament. But on a day-to-day level, ministers, I think, are neutered, castrated, and really it's these faceless bureaucrats who tend to all be of a similar mindset who are running Britain. We live in a quangocracy at least as much as we live in a democracy.
It's hilarious, as you referred to earlier, that particularly centre-left politicians say when they want to set up, a football regulator or a regulator for newspapers or a regulator, I know, for sock production, they say, well, these, of course, as you said, will be independent, as if these people have no partisan political views. All human beings have political views, and if you select a whole load who often tend to be cronies linked to the party in power, of course they're going to impose politically partisan outcomes.
Yes, I mean, they might not be partisan, but I think they're definitely ideological. If you set up a sock regulator, it is unlikely to be populated by people who think that socks don't really require much regulation, right? It's highly likely to be populated by people who are extremely concerned about the ills of sock manufacturing in the United Kingdom and believe that it would be a tragedy if the terrible way that we presently manufacture socks is not properly addressed by an independent arm's-length body. I've often thought this is a problem. I mean, it's not so much that there's a conspiracy. It's that birds of a feather flock together, right? So you, on the website Conservative Home, bless them, I'm a regular reader, but they do their best to sort of refer people to public appointments that might be coming up and encouraging people of a conservative mindset to apply. But as far as I'm aware, very few do. Well, why might that be? Well, broadly speaking, if you're a sort of free market, conservative-minded person, you probably don't want to spend your life, I don't know, regulating the price of milk in East Derbyshire, right? That's just not in your mindset. So once you set up this regulatory infrastructure, it is almost certain to be policed by people who think that is a sensible way of running the world. It's almost impossible to believe, for example, that the head of Ofcom, that regulates, amongst other things, what counts as fair and balanced news coverage, is going to be headed up by somebody who thinks, well, I can leave that to the market. I mean, if the viewers don't think it's fair and balanced, they'll switch it off and go to somewhere else that's fair and balanced. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Are they partisan? Well, I mean, it's difficult to measure. I mean, these people are faceless and very difficult to poll. But they all, I think, are of a kind of bien pensant mindset that an enlightened elite are best to guide and influence, nudge, possibly sometimes shove the wider British electorate, the proles, into certain forms of behaviour. And they must stand between market forces, if you like, and the great unwashed. And that this is a vital part of living in a civilized society. So you're always going to get that. You're not going to get deregulators working for regulators. It won't happen. So that's why we've got to where we've got to.
Another dimension of this phenomenon, this anti-democratic or post-democratic phenomenon, is the way in which judges are becoming sort of political activists or political decision takers. And I think we've seen that, haven't we, with the Birmingham bin strike? I mean, that is the direct consequence of a decision about wages made by judges.
Yeah. So I think you've got a whole lot going on. We're now reaping the whirlwind of a range of changes that came in basically from Blair onwards. And I think, although I'm a member of the Conservative Party, I would confess that the Conservative Party, in its 14 years in office, continued this trend. Perhaps not at the same speed that Labour would have done, but nevertheless continued the trend. And there are essentially two big elements to it. One is this independent arm's length body. We're not going to allow politicians to decide how important it is to protect bats on a train line to Birmingham. Heaven forfend that an elected politician might make the judgment that we either need to save the bats or kill the bats. No. We need an independent sort of bat authority to decide that we're going to build a £100 million bat tunnel, because this is a perfect sort of independent scientific approach to the way we should manage things. Of course, COVID is a standout example of this as well. So you get all this apparent independent expertise that I think in the case of the bat tunnel, I think it might all be a bit moot now, because I'm not even sure whether HS2 will ever be completed. But I think that the taxpayer's on the hook for £500,000 per bat saved. I'm not totally certain that politicians of any stripe would consider that a good use of taxpayers' resources. But the second bit that you rightly point to is judicial activism. That rather than judges being apolitical, they are now making decisions which I think can only be considered political. Now, I don't wholly blame them for that. If you give enormous, widespread judicial discretion, expect judges to exercise it. But the case you referred to of the catastrophe that has befallen Birmingham, as we speak at the moment, I think there are 21,000 tonnes of rubbish piled up on the various streets.
I mean, this is like Naples about 20 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, this is unbelievable. I mean, you would consider this, if you were in some absolutely dirt poor society somewhere in the world, this would be unacceptable. It's the equivalent in weight terms of 500 elephants. That's essentially what you've got on the streets of Birmingham. Now, why? Well, it is a complicated story because you can argue that the council has been badly managed for some time. I think that's true. They spaffed away £100 million on some IT system that doesn't work. That seems to be almost mandatory, actually, for virtually any government authority in Britain, that you have to spaff away hundreds of millions on an IT system that doesn't work. But the biggest problem behind the state of Birmingham City Council's finances is to do with an equal pay decision that was made in a court, which is based on the Equality Act. And long story short, the judgment was that Birmingham City Council were not paying different cohorts of workers fairly. And let me explain what I mean by that. There was not a suggestion that a female or a black refuse collection worker, bin man, was paid differently to a white male bin man. There wasn't any evidence of this. It was suggested, however, that rates of pay seemed higher in sectors which were predominantly male-dominated, let's say refuse collection, compared to areas which were predominantly female-dominated, let's say teaching assistants. And this had to be equalised, therefore. This apparently showed, according to a court, some sort of misogyny. And Birmingham City Council effectively goes bankrupt at this point. Now, you may argue if they'd not gone bankrupt, they still would have mismanaged their finances in a disastrous fashion. But we're talking hundreds of millions of pounds in back pay to settle this case to a whole bunch of workers who were, say, in a female-leaning sector rather than a male-leaning sector. And I don't see any particular reason to believe that that won't be a recurring problem in each and every council. Birmingham, I think, handled it particularly badly. But why do we want judges to make those sort of decisions? To be there saying, well, actually, I think this particular role of, collecting refuse, it seems to me a bit similar to that particular role. And it's intruding into the private sector as well, as do the supermarket and Next, the chain store have both fallen foul of this. So Next, I think it was to do with warehouse workers against checkout assistants or people working on the shop floor, more or less. Warehouse workers tend to be men. That shop floor workers tend to be women, as a rule. Next was found to be paying warehouse workers more than shop floor workers. But the idea a court should determine what the difference or the similarity is between those two types of work, which strike me as being very different. I mean, they're similar in the sense that you have to get out of bed, you have to go to a place of work, and you have to apply yourself to a range of tasks over a given number of hours. But other than that, they're extraordinarily different. I mean, what next? Should a court determine that ketchup and mustard are about similar? These are two sauces that you put on the side of your plate in order to flavour your food, and therefore it's an outrage that per milliliter mustard costs more. We need to fix the price of ketchup and mustard because they're similar. So courts are determining this. They're having an enormous role now in immigration, particularly under Article 8 of the European Convention of Human Rights, which relates to your right to a family and private life. Again, pretty vague what that means. And if it remains vague, judges are going to interpret it. What's it mean to the judge? There's no parliamentary guidance here on really what that means. We've enshrined the Human Rights Act into English law. So you get these preposterous decisions in which you can't send me back to Albania because my son likes the flavour of chicken nuggets in England.
That's a real case.
This is a real case. This is not one of my jokes.
You're exaggerating.
I don't need any jokes anymore. I just report the facts and people laugh, mock. So you can't possibly send us back to Albania. Now, one doesn't need to be too hysterical here. That was a first instance decision, unlikely to stick. But nevertheless, these sort of judgments are being handed down. Just a day or two ago, you can't send me back to my country because I've got too many Facebook friends. And therefore too many people know my views, and therefore I'm a greater risk of persecution. Unbelievable that these are the sorts of decisions made in courts. So what we've seen since, I would say, the late 90s is we're trying to take the politics out of politics. We're trying to pretend it's not a political decision whether you deport someone or not based on the dietary preferences of their children. That it's not a political decision about whether you equalise pay between warehouse workers and shop floor workers. That it's not a political decision to decide whether you need a giant bat tunnel when you're building a railway. These are apparently, we're told, not political decisions. These are just now technical matters best left in the hands of the experts. So to my mind, the root cause is we tried to decontroversialise vast areas of decision making in what, in instance by instance, look like, relatively minor cases. These are not earth-shattering decisions like, are we going to go to war or not? But nevertheless, all of these decisions are now supposedly made by judges and experts, not by politicians. So we've tried to take the politics out of politics, and that leaves you with a quangocracy running your lives and a judiciary running your lives, just what we've got.
Can we go from chicken McNuggets and mustard to Fukuyama's end of history thesis?
Yeah, this is what's to blame for the scenario we're in, I think. Look, it's a bit rum to entirely blame Francis Fukuyama for the bat tunnel and rubbish piling up in Birmingham and the football regulator. But I think his idea in the early 90s that history had ended, liberal democracy had triumphed. Obviously, this is in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. So all we need to do now is a bit of fine-tuning, really. I mean, there are no great grand debates left to be had. Some sort of form of Western liberal democratic capitalism has now conquered the communist east of Europe, and, sooner or later it will be the norm right across planet Earth. And so all we really need now is to just sort of fine-tune a dial here or a dial there or a number somewhere else. And in my view, again, without wanting to completely blame Fukuyama for all of the errors made, if you like, in his name or on the basis of his thinking, that's what leads to this catastrophe, that we think we can take the politics out of politics because politics is over, apparently. It's done. The final battle and the final victory has been reached. It's the end of the movie, and we just need to worry about making sure everybody's properly listed in the end credits sequence. And we can leave that to the experts rather than the director. No more real big decisions to be made. But it's turned out, of course, I think unsurprisingly, certainly in retrospect, but he was completely wrong. That controversies, debates, different judgments, different ideologies continue to clash, and we need an arena of conflict in which we adjudicate between those different ideas and arguments. I happen to think, in general terms, that arena of conflict is one in which you need freedom of speech and expression and a ballot box. But if you've undermined those to an enormous extent, then actually what you get is all the fine-tuning isn't even discussed over the dispatch box. And I say it's no longer fine-tuning. There are big, big decisions to make that suggest that history has not ended. But we've ended up with this. It's all just fine-tuning, and, we'll have the trappings of the democracy, but everybody broadly agrees. They don't. They won't. And we've therefore locked ourselves into being governed by a group who, as I say, just as a cohort, tend to have a particular view of the world, which is extremely difficult for a democratic politician to override.
The irony of all this is that a sort of Chinese model of politics seems to be being visited upon Britain and the rest of Western Europe. So that you've got a situation in which it is ostensibly a capitalist economy, but with an authoritarian system of politics, which is anti-democratic. So we've already got sort of Chinese social credit policies with British characteristics being imposed upon
What would be an
us.
example of that?
So the cancel culture.
Right, yeah.
That if you've got the wrong views, you express the wrong views, particularly if you're working within the public sector, but also increasingly in big private companies, though I know there's a difference there, that you can find yourself out of a job.
Yes.
You can find yourself prosecuted now for praying in silence outside of an abortion clinic,
Yes.
and so on and on.
That's true.
So what we're seeing is actually the takeover of the West by an alien authoritarian system of politics, rather than Fukuyama's prediction that Western-style political economy would, as you said, sweep the world.
Well, it's interesting that. I mean, I wonder whether the two are actually consistent. That I'm completely putting words into Fukuyama's mouth here. But my idea said, there's a broad agreement on freedom of speech. There's just a bit of fine-tuning to be done. Virtually nobody believes in completely untrammeled freedom of speech. People do agree, for example, that you could sign a contract of employment that might limit what you can say. And therefore a Fukuyama-ist approach to this might be to say, well, all of these are just sort of fine-tuning matters about what public sector workers can say, whether they can put a political poster in their window. If you work for, I don't know, a vegetarian restaurant, might there be an undertaking that you don't have all over your social media feed, you chomping into a nice rare steak and saying how great it is to, eat some red meat. And even on the other side of the argument, if you were to look at this in the old-fashioned left-right way of looking at it, we've had a recent fiasco in popular culture of the live-action remake of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. It's totally tanked at the box office, and one suggested reason for this is the outspoken political views of Rachel Zegler, who plays Snow White in this rather absurd movie. I mean, they've had all sorts of problems with it. They decided it would be wrong to employ dwarf actors to play the dwarfs. So if you are a dwarf and an actor, one of your great opportunities to hit the silver screen has been ripped away from you. But Zegler was prone to take to the airwaves, and I think she cursed Donald Trump and said something along the lines of anyone who voted for Donald Trump should burn in hell or some such like. And Disney, by all accounts, are furious with her, and it's made the movie tank, and she probably won't get another job with Disney again. Is that a breach of her freedom of speech? I'm not so sure. So I think we've got to look at, it seems to be reasonable that you could expect the lead person in a film to refrain from making statements that might alienate a very large chunk of the audience that you are aiming for. If you want to bang on about free Palestine and Donald Trump's terrible, you are entirely free to do so, but you're not free to do so if you've just signed a multi-million-pound contract to play Snow White for Disney. So I think there are layers and layers here. I don't think we're so much in the Chinese model or the scale of that authoritarianism. I think it's a little bit more like the GDR. It's not as bad as the GDR yet as well. I don't want to sound hysterical. But there's this sort of soft, creepy cancel culture that you're not carted down to a Siberian salt mine for having said the wrong thing at 3 o'clock in the morning, or shot dead by MI5 or MI6 for saying the wrong thing. There was an element of this creepy stuff of police turning up at your door. Alison Pearson, the journalist who had this, couldn't tell her what tweet had offended her. But she was not carted off and shot. Let's just be clear about that, which probably would have happened in China. It's a rather softer, creepier undermining of confidence that you don't... And therefore, the citizenry, and indeed probably elected politicians, think twice before saying nothing. It just has a chilling effect. We're not herding people into concentration camps. By and large, we're not firing people from their places of work or completely crushing their livelihood. but we've made it
Well, in the
difficult.
public sector, I think that is happening.
Well,
I mean, in the private sector, I take your point.
But don't you think in the
that
public,
there's a different dynamic there, a different type of
yeah,
relation?
okay, but
I think the public sector very much is the case.
But do you not think in the public sector, you may say that this has been it's been uneven in the way it's been executed, but do you not think in the public sector, if you're a public sector worker or a civil servant, you should refrain from political activity and political comment?
Well, I think that what we're seeing is people who, even within the private confines of public sector institutions, for example, within the NHS, people are very concerned about policies regarding putting teenagers on puberty blockers and stuff.
Yeah.
If they even just express that in private meetings, we're not talking about, handing out leaflets and, to patients and this kind of thing within the hospital. Some of them are actually being told if they continue with this, expressing these views. We've seen that with, for example, Scottish nurses who didn't want to share a changing room with a bloke who was claiming to be a woman, and so on and so forth. So, and we're seeing that, within academia, people getting kicked out for expressing views. So I think,
but we've got to unparcel some of these, right? So to my mind, look, I am against the National Health Service issuing puberty blockers, and I would radically change the way we deliver healthcare in this country rather than having just this giant monopolistic National Health Service, which is producing disastrous outcomes. But put that aside, if you're going to have a National Health Service, the decision about what drugs it provides needs to be made by the Secretary of State for Health and the government, not by the functionaries. I mean, you can have an argument. My point is that the argument about whether you're going to issue puberty blockers or not is an argument of the ballot box, and it's a decision for Wes Streeting, our health secretary, and it's a matter of public debate. But if you are actually the drug dispenser at Little Puddleshire Hospital, I'm not sure I'm very interested in your views. You're not elected to make decisions, either pro or anti-puberty blockers. Your job is to dispense the medicine and the drugs that the National Health Service and run by politicians have decided you can dispense, that and no more. So I'm rather relaxed about public sector workers not being able to have views here. If you want to have views about what drugs should be dispensed and what shouldn't, don't work as a drugs dispenser for the National Health Service. Go and do something else. If you want to express views about how terrible Donald Trump is or how we should free Palestine, do not become the lead actor in a Disney movie. So I think there are nuances here where we shouldn't take the view that freedom of speech means all people in all jobs, irrespective of contractual requirements or a presumption of neutrality, should be able to express their views in any which way they see fit. Now, where I think there really is an issue is it seems to me some views which I would consider are political and ideological are able to be spread in the public sector. It seems to me DEI stuff is an ideological take on the world. It isn't just fine tuning. It isn't just a nuance about an HR training scheme. It is a major deal about how you see humanity. Expressing support for that should be, in my view, treated as being as political as expressing opposition to it.
Yes, absolutely. And that is what is happening, in the sense that the state is using its capacity to try to ideologically rewire people, while at the same time punishing people who will express, often for professional reasons, particularly in relation to how young troubled adolescents should be treated. So they're trying to express a view that is related to their professional expertise, but are being told they can't do that and that they're at their risk of being sacked. So that's why I
think if you're being asked for a medical opinion and you're a medical expert, you should be able to give that medical opinion without fear or favour. I would agree with that. I mean, the problem is, I think we've become so lacking in resilience as a nation, well, and possibly on an individual level, that pleas to authority just work far too easily. I mean, basically, if you're armed with a graph, you can basically get away with anything. I mean, the COVID lockdown was the classic example of this. I mean, we were run by basically a specialist quango, Sage. And they can put up all of these lines on a graph saying, worst case scenario, X 100,000 are going to die. I mean, all of these things, turn out to, after the event, to have had a much greater margin of error. You almost can, stick a pin in a dartboard. But once you actually show, I'm an expert in this area, I know how it's going to go, whether this is about number of deaths from COVID or whether it's about the threat of climate change, that plea to authority, culturally and politically, has way, way too much impact. The OBR, in terms of our economic forecasting, I mean, is completely ludicrous. I'm with Mervyn King to say trying to predict the economy more than a year out is nearly impossible. And even within a year, there's so much at stake. But we are basing our fiscal policy on what the Office for Budget Responsibility think the growth rate is going to be to 0.1 of a decimal point over the next 5 years. Completely preposterous. We've fallen for this plea to authority. Now, I mean, I think you can make some general assertions. It's pretty unlikely we're going to get heroic levels of economic growth over the next 5 years. It's pretty unlikely that we will have a complete collapse of the economy over the next 5 years. I think it's reasonable to say we're going to grow somewhere between, 0 and 2% per annum. But you can't be more specific than that. And we try to base all of these policies on unbelievable specificity, meaning that our fiscal policy in Britain is based more on what the pointy heads at the OBR believe is likely to transpire in 5 years' time, and whether growth is going to be 1.8% or 1.7% or 1.6%, rather than the arguments put forward by Rachel Reeves or Mel Stride, her opposite number. Yet another example. I mean, I'm making a kind of cultural point here about a plea to authority. Again, constitutionally, the Parliament could just say, well, we've seen your numbers, we don't believe them. But culturally, it seems to me that's now extremely difficult to do in the UK. You would find it very difficult to survive a single media interview. I'm not necessarily Boris Johnson's biggest cheerleader, but I think his instincts were against the severity and nature of COVID lockdowns, but he felt he couldn't fight back against these pleas to authority. If you come in with a pie chart and a graph and purport to be an expert on something, whether it's COVID or climate change, or going back to our earlier points, the terrible social ills that are caused by the way we do sock manufacturing in Britain, you have a very good chance of getting your way through a soft central planning system.
And it's worse than that in the sense that it's not just about cultural influence. The state is now actually directly intervening to prevent the expression of views which, rightly or wrongly, contradict those of the so-called experts. So in the horrific, as I believe it to be, Online Safety Act, incredibly pioneered by Boris, no doubt encouraged by Carrie and Nadine Dorries and others, the government is going to be able to censor anything it considers to be misinformation. Well, we saw the start of that with COVID, when Brigade 77 and these other kind of spooky state agencies, without wanting to sound too, swivel-eyed about it, were directly intervening to block people who had nonconformist views about the lockdown and vaccines. Well, now there are Labour MPs and Greens, of course, saying, oh, well, we should do the same on climate change. People who are climate change deniers or oppose net zero. So the state is actively intervening now to actually suppress.
Yep, that's true. That is true and concerning, and again goes to my, Fukuyama has won for the time being type theory, that the idea is we're all agreed on the basic facts, and if you, it's sort of supremely unhelpful for people to argue that the world is indeed flat rather than a sphere, or that we didn't go to the moon or whatever. There's an objective truth out there, and we're just trying to fine-tune the little bits of politics and energy policy and other policies just in order to get the best outcome. And this is in essence, a technical pursuit, not an ideological one. That's it. That, in my view, is the mindset. I mean, I say I reject that because it seems to be all the technical pursuits involve the state having more power over the individual, which we might want to argue for, but seems to me to have an ideology behind it. But these people, I think, are technocrats more than that they are sort of full-blooded communists. However, in the area of online, although I agree with you that they're rather chilling, these sort of things, and people getting a knock at their door for saying something untoward on Twitter is ludicrous. And indeed, people going to prison for it. We've got, what's her name, Lucy Connolly, who made, I was going to say off-colour. It's worse than off-colour. I mean, a very grim, I don't care if you burn down, for all I care, the asylum hotels can burn down or some such like, which is a very distasteful, unpleasant thing to say. But 2 years in prison, I mean, that is bananas. I mean, to my mind, it's not a criminal offence at all, let alone one that would get custody of that ilk. However, this is one area, let's try and have a little bit of optimism. The statists are probably going to lose here. This is the modern day equivalent of the printing press. And there is a similar moral panic, huge moral panic in Victorian times about penny dreadfuls, all the sort of scandal sheets which can now easily be printed by God only knows who. I think my history is not strong enough here, but I think if I'm right, the printing press also caused great concern that copies of the Bible might hit the market that had not been, handwritten by monks,
or that were, printed in English.
Or printed in English, yeah. What a horror! How do we stop this? And in my view, maybe I'll be proved wrong. The genie's out of the bottle on this. So technology has, in effect, led to an explosion of freedom of speech, a massive explosion of freedom of speech. This podcast, right? Yeah, sure. Theoretically, the police could raid the studio, take you down. Theoretically, on each platform you put it up on, they could tear it down because of, what they deem to be unreasonable content or what the state tells them is unreasonable content. That's technically possible. But by and large, we're seeing an explosion in the spread of ideas. We are seeing a collapse in the barriers to entry to spread those ideas. 25 years ago, it would have been inconceivable that you could hire a studio and produce basically a television program to compete with the BBC or ITV. Now it's, hundreds of people are doing it. I mean, obviously you're doing it brilliantly, but hundreds of people are trying to do it. This is fantastic news, all in all. And I wonder if in 20, 50, 100 years' time, we will look back on these, attempts to ban legal but harmful content and sort of online safety measures as the last dying gasp, the dead cat bounce against what is a wonderful explosion of free speech in all sorts of different ways. And I would like to think an unstoppable flow now of new ideas, that the establishment, just as they were with, too many Bibles, too many Victorian scandal sheets, too many different weird and wacky ideas now on YouTube and on Twitter, I strongly suspect they are not going to win that one, and they can't. There will be grave injustices, of that I'm sure. But in the fullness of time, freedom of expression and diversity of ideas looks set to me to triumph.
Well, let's hope so, but it might be also another possible avenue they might go down will be to take ever more draconian steps, because I think there's the possibility that the political class, which is now defined, according to your analysis and one I share, by their ownership of the political system, rather than, other forms of historic elitism which are based on people owning land and economic assets. So if you have a political class that owns the political system, then they're going to be very, very reluctant to let that go, as we're seeing now. And so if they have to ramp up the authoritarianism to maintain their control, I mean, this was the point, was it not, that George Orwell made? and James Burnham in his analysis of the sort of emergence of a new managerial class from the 1930s onwards. So that's another possibility.
It is, and look, I don't want to be flippant about it, and perhaps my shining ray of optimism will be snuffed out before we know it. It's possible. But I think that the developments in technology are making it harder and harder for the ruling political elite to squash us. Not impossible, but the lengths you would have to go to now, to, if you like, maintain or seize control of the political narrative in the UK is an enormously more complex task, which I suppose hypothetically you could achieve through absolute extreme brutality. But, if you're not a party member, you're going to be marched off. And if anyone ever turns you in, and we employ a third of the population to secretly work for the British Stasi, and
or if they define you as being, a member of the far right, which seems to be a very sinister development.
Yes, all of that.
The use of that line as a sinister development.
You could go, you could paint a scenario where the political class decide to do that, and if you're a member of an opposition political party, you're thrown into prison, some such like, and brutal authoritarianism. You could say that we're going in that direction. I just, however, think, in truth, again, going back to my printing press issue, it is fantastically hard to police in any universal fashion. Back in the day, if you wanted to control the political narrative of the United Kingdom, and again, I'm not suggesting that there's a grand central intelligence doing this, it's more of a hive mind, then really all you needed to have was the BBC and pretty strict tram lines for our 10 national newspapers. If you could basically keep those on the straight and narrow, and there clearly was diversity in the newspaper market, but that was it, really. If you could keep the newspapers in line, and the state broadcaster was, easily the biggest source of news and views for the for a huge chunk of the population, you're pretty much there. Well, good luck trying to police every single YouTube channel and every single Twitter account. You may pluck a few off, and you may treat people brutally who you don't like, and in a kind of pour encourager les autres type theory. But I suspect the genie's now out of the bottle, that you are not, and even if they shut down YouTube, which, basically can't do this offshore anyway, you've got a real headache here. Let me give you a kind of, if you are a central planner, you've got a real headache. Let me give you another example. Again, prosaic, really rather petty. But one of my interests is American football, NFL. And so each year I pay, it's about $100 or something, to get the NFL sports package. You can watch American football games on Sky, but they select just one or two. And if you want to watch a particular team or a particular game, you buy this NFL.com sports package, which I do. I then plug my computer into my television set, watch the New Orleans Saints typically get thrashed. But during the match, when it goes to commercial breaks, I get American adverts. Quite a lot of these adverts would be banned in the United Kingdom. So in the United Kingdom, you are not able, it's not legal to advertise prescription drugs. In the US, it is. So prescription drugs, albeit they may have a different brand in America, it might not be that I would know exactly how to acquire it, but I get to see these advertisements. How is the Advertising Standards Agency going to police this? If we move further on, stupid bans about, you can't try and sell a pizza because it's fattening to people or something. Which, we're a whisker away from all this.
Sorry, of course.
It still, it seems to be worrying and petty. But ultimately, well, I'm going to start watching American pizza advertisements then. What are you going to do with my computer plugged in, wired up to the internet, connected to Austin, Texas, seeing this stuff? So, yeah, I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't, be on guard here. But it seems to me that the scale of forces at play strongly favour the wider freedom of expression triumphing over an attempt to suppress it universally, even if there are some ghastly singular examples of picking off people who are outside of the mainstream thinking.
Coming back to the UK, be interested to know What is your preferred strategy now for undermining the quangocracy, the new class, call it what you will, what I call the parallel state? What should happen?
Yes.
What should the centre-right do in concrete terms?
In concrete terms, the centre-right has got to get radical. So there's almost no point in a centre-right party winning an election if its view is we will manage things slightly better than the incumbent government. That what matters, they would effectively be saying, is if you put slightly brighter people in charge of the Politburo, it would work a lot better. That is a hopeless argument. Even if you buy into the fact that the opposition shadow cabinet might indeed be brighter or better intentioned than the Labour cabinet, it is arguing about how sound the Politburo is, which is the argument that we must not have. So the centre-right, by which in party political terms I mean the Conservative Party and Reform UK, I think need to advocate for a complete restoration of the core democratic principles of Britain. A huge repeal of the legislation that has been enacted over the past 25 years that has empowered quangos, that has empowered judges to make political decisions, that has effectively stripped Parliament of its power. So let me take all 444 quangos, if indeed that's still the accurate number. They should all be either abolished, privatised, there might be some that can stand on their own 2 feet, or nationalised, by which I mean brought fully within ministerial control. The whole lot. The whole lot. I mean, I don't mind the chance.
Including the Bank of England?
Yeah, I think including the Bank of England.
Good.
The whole lot should be brought under control. Now, you might still have a few Chinese walls that the Bank of England doesn't just set the interest rates based entirely on what the Chancellor of the Exchequer, phones up one morning and says, I've decided to put interest rates up 3%. You can work exactly how it links in, but it has to be answerable. It's nearly impossible to get rid of the Governor of the Bank of England. Well, I mean, that's ludicrous, given that monetary policy is such a vital part of the economy. So the whole enchilada needs to be reset. I would abolish the Supreme Court and go back to the law lords. Parliament needs to be made sovereign again. And then you'll get what you vote for. That's, and I think the disillusion in British politics, and it might be the electorate haven't necessarily sort of plugged all this in together in terms of their thinking, but it seems to me the electorate are saying, well, I keep sort of trying to vote for things, so does everybody else, and they don't happen. I mean, Brexit very nearly didn't happen. Well, how? We voted, what on earth's happening here? Immigration, whatever you think the immigration policy should be, consistently the electorate have voted for lower levels of immigration. The opposite has happened. Whichever party you vote for, apparently makes no difference. So the proposition to the electorate from the right and centre parties needs to be, we are actually going to restore democracy. At the moment, there is this out-of-touch, elitist, bureaucratic model, including a good number of people in the House of Commons, who are just not sensitive to the desires and the wants and the aspirations of the British people. And indeed, oftentimes, take a rather dim and patronising and sneering view of ordinary people's thoughts, dreams and aspirations. That's going to change. We are going to put Parliament in complete control. And if you deliver a parliamentary majority to a bunch of people or a particular political party, they'll be in control. They'll decide. There won't be any more, I don't comment on operational matters, or, well, this is what the OBR said. No. If you want some economic forecasters in the Treasury, hire them, and then you come out and tell us the numbers. It will be your numbers. You can listen to whichever forecaster you want. If you want a giant bat tunnel over a railway line, you go and defend that. You don't say, well, the experts at Natural England have done this, that and the other. So you colossally re-empower Parliament. And then we go back to having the fights that we should be having. Do you want taxes to be higher or lower? Do you want the public sector to spend as much as it is at the moment, or more or less? But these should be political battles across the dispatch box. So there needs to be a great restoration of the core principles of British parliamentary sovereignty in order to empower the people. And what you vote for is what you'll get. And if you lose an election, you go again next time and try and vote for your guys in next time. I think that is, in broad terms, a pretty inspiring message. Not because the electorate know the ins and outs of the interpretation of Article 8 of the European Convention of Human Rights as it pertains to deportation cases at first instance in a particular court, but because they are now wired to be thinking the political elite are out of control. I don't really think anybody's interested in acting in my interests. I don't think they listen. Westminster is detached. The ruling class of this country are detached. I want that to change. And it's almost the same slogan that was used in the Brexit campaign, take back control. That, I think, completely chimed, not just with people's disillusionment with the European Union, but with them politically in general, and is not exclusive to the European Union. The Whitehall bureaucracy is as bad as the Brussels bureaucracy, sometimes worse. And I think a campaign to put it back in its box would be an enormously popular one. And resetting and restoring Britain to about its coordinates of April 1997 is what's needed to get us out of this ghastly, bureaucratic pseudo-nightmare we live in.
So it's a second really English, I would say British, civil war. We need to restore the ethos, or revive the ethos of the Levellers and the British radical nonconformist tradition. And that will involve people on the centre-right, particularly people who think of themselves as conservatives, developing a completely different mindset to the British state and the constitutional status quo.
Yes, I mean, I think I've been largely persuaded by the thoughts of the historian David Starkey in this regard. I don't think it is a civil war or a revolution. I think it's closer to 1688, 1689, the so-called Glorious Revolution, but essentially a restoration. We had the Civil War. We instilled Cromwell as the great protector. And we decide after a few years, this is grim. We want to go back. We want to reset our system. And Charles II comes over from Jersey and we restore the monarchy. Now, it's not an exact parallel to that, but it's a restoration we're talking about here, not a revolution and a kind of year zero setting. It's going back to what prevailed from 1997 and prior to 1997. And one thing I'm keen that the right of centre don't go down is to purely be destructive, to say that our solution is just to torch everything, burn this down, burn that down. I mean, there's a lot that needs to be closed and shuttered, sure. But the aim of it is to restore the principles of parliamentary democracy and parliamentary sovereignty. And that's a restoration, not a revolution.
It's been fascinating talking to you, Mark, and I'm going to end by asking you a question I ask everybody. If you had a Trump-like executive order superpower, what is it you would do with that? Who would you get rid of? Or what would you create?
And am I able to apply this globally or only to the United Kingdom?
I would prefer if you applied it to the United Kingdom. Well, give us one of each quickly.
Okay. Well, I think globally I'd probably abolish all tariffs. So I would use my Trump superpower rather differently to the way the man himself has used his.
So you're now on a MAGA hit list.
Yeah. So I would encourage free trade. I'm worried we're entering into a protectionist scenario, and not one based on any rational thinking. What I would do domestically, which is not either an exciting or unpredictable answer, is I would magic into existence a great repeal bill, and I'd pass it through Parliament. I'd do it by executive order if that was the constitutional process. It's likely it would have to pass through Parliament. It's likely it will probably be a series of bills rather than one. But the content of that would be to repeal the Human Rights Act, to leave the UCHR, probably to exit the Refugee Convention, to scrap the Equality Act. There's a whole range of other areas around the civil service and electoral law that's grown up, which I would get rid of. There's probably about 10 or 11 key statutes I would scrap. And I would also, in that context, actually, which may surprise you, take some steps to politicise the civil service. I think that we are living in this fiction that you started out talking about, Mark, that these people are sort of supposedly independent, but come with their own ideological baggage. I think we should recognise that. And if you're at the senior levels of the civil service, let's say a permanent secretary or director general or director level in the civil service, I think we'd be talking about, say, about 3,000 jobs there. Those should be political appointments. It doesn't matter whether, Mary in accounts is a political appointment, or Bill the window cleaner, or Janet the tea lady, the people who are actually just making the thing operate. That's kind of fine. They needn't be. But the top brass should be appointed by the government, meaning when you come into a department, those people come in with you. You presumably trust them and are aligned with them, and they are aligned with you on the particular plan you're going to execute. And as and when and if the government falls, they fall with you. That, I think, would be a far more honest way to conduct politics and would underscore this key principle. You'll get what you vote for. You'll get what you vote for. It's going to be the Secretary of State in charge, not Sir Humphrey Appleby. If the Prime Minister doesn't like Sir Humphrey Appleby is gone. I think that would go a considerable way to restoring faith and confidence in the system, but also, crucially, making it work.
And our capacity to dictate policy towards bats as well.
Well, quite. I mean, that's exactly the sort of thing which I think should be entirely up to the bat minister. I mean, you can argue whether you need a bat minister or not, but I'm sure we have one. There's going to be some minister for animal welfare somewhere. And, the decision they make on bats might very well determine how you choose to vote at the next election. But it should be that, not the bat quango that decides.
Mark Littlewood, thank you so much.
It's been a real pleasure.